Hello everybody, it's Ben Wilkinson here. I'm the Festival Director for the Spirit of Independence Film Festival, and I'm delighted and very slightly nervous of doing our one and only live Zoom Q&A. But I think this is going to be a great experience for everyone involved. And I'm delighted to introduce our panel that we've got. So, first off, we have Lily Yasuda from Boise, Idaho, and her film Like Love is playing at the festival at the moment. We've also got Debbie Howard, who's an old friend of mine who directed a documentary a few years ago called Still Loved, and currently does some work for the BBC. I'm delighted to welcome back Andy Morganlander, who came and visited us last year when her film Luke and Joe played at the very first festival that we had. And also, I'm very much delighted to welcome Andrea Cornwall to the Q&A as well. Andrea is a producer of St. Maud, so congratulations on all the positive reviews and feedback and the performance of St. Maud as well. I think it's looking great at the moment. But I'm not going to be the one who's talking today. I'm actually going to hand over to Michaela Smith, who's the audience coordinator for the Showroom Cinema, and she's going to be leading the Q&A. And this session is about redefining an industry, and Michaela's going to get into the questions about it. So really, it's going to look at sort of gender inequality and how we can shape the industry so it is more inclusive for the future. So thank you very much. That'll be the last you hear from me for a bit. If you do have any questions at all, and you don't kind of want to hang on to the end, or you have any technical issues, please use the chat function, send a message to me, and I'll handle it, and we can perhaps interject with a question if it's at the right point. So, Michaela, I'm just going to hand over to you now.
Lovely, thank you. And thank you for coordinating this panel, Ben, all your hard work on the festival and inviting us all. I'm really excited to have this conversation. Hopefully it's in nice, safe hands. So I was just going to start and just ask everyone to introduce themselves, but I suppose, Ben, you've already done that. But does anyone have anything they want to add? Any projects you're currently working on? Anything at the moment?
Serious panel.
Very serious, suddenly. Okay, so just to kind of kick us off, I wanted to talk about kind of access to industry and getting into the industry, because I think it can be quite difficult to know where to start. Like, no matter where you are in industry, I'm obviously a film programmer, but I didn't know that was a job that you could even have until I saw it advertised and was like, oh, I can choose films for people. So it would be great to get a sense for all of you what your first job in film was, and how you got into it. Don't know who wants to start. Should I direct?
Yeah, you should probably direct.
Debbie, do you want to start with Debbie?
Okay. So my background was acting. I sort of went straight into being an actor from school, really. But I never went to drama school or anything. I just sort of naively thought I'll move to London and go and do that. So it was quite, tricky. It didn't sort of happen straight away. But eventually, I started off doing fringe and profit share and student films and lots of unpaid work, and then eventually started to get paid work and got my equity card, and spent about sort of 10 years or so, or more maybe, probably doing theatre. And then I ended up moving to Sheffield with some plans that went completely another way, and I ended up getting pregnant as soon as I moved to Sheffield and had twins. So I didn't think, I can really sort of go on tour anymore and all that kind of thing. So I got a new agent and started doing sort of TV and film, and did 10 years acting in sort of TV stuff. And then I got to about 40 and started to realise, things have got a bit better, by the way, but started to realise it was just really grim for female actors once you got to about 40. The roles started to get smaller and more rubbish. So I got a bit frustrated with that. And so I originally started having a go at writing with a view originally to writing parts that I could then play. That was my plan. So I started writing some short films, and then another female director I knew in Sheffield sort of said to me, why don't you have a go at directing them? And I was like, I don't know how to make a film. And she was like, well, you do, you've been on enough sets, why don't you give it a go? And I was like, oh, I don't know. So I applied for a scheme that was then coming up at Screen Yorkshire called Court Short, and you made a 5-minute film, and you had, I think it was 5 days or like a week or something to go from getting your script to having this film on a screen in a screening. So it was like a baptism of fire, thrown in the deep end. That wasn't something I'd written, I was just directing. And I remember walking onto set the first day, it was quite funny, I'll always remember this, and just sort of waiting for someone to tell me what to do, because I was an actor. And somebody was like, Debbie, you're the director. And I was like, oh. So I had to sort of suddenly lead it, and I found that quite, strange. So I did that, really, really enjoyed it. And then, so from there I set up my company, Big Buddha Films, and I just made loads of shorts. I look back on some of them now and I'm kind of embarrassed about some of them, and others are okay. But I guess that was my learning. That was, I didn't go to film school or anything. So I was figuring out how to make a film. And some of them came out okay and did really well in festivals and things, and others not so good. But, I learned a lot from each one, and I had to go at all kinds of different genres. And then I ended up making my first feature doc, Still Loved, that you mentioned earlier, which was a long time in the making, and I'm really proud of that piece of work. And from there I've gone on to doing other documentaries and other projects and feature films and directing telly. So it's kind of been but all of it has been completely self-taught. I've never had any training in anything. So it's probably been a long way around, but also I like learning that way. I think it's just, I think it's just how I learn, by doing something and getting it wrong and then getting it right, hopefully.
Thank you, Debbie. You've made some really interesting points that I'm going to come back to, but I just want to ask everyone. So what about you, Lily?
So I did go the film school route. I graduated from Chapman University in Orange County, California in spring of 2018, which was the catalyst for Like Love, the feature that's screening at SOI right now. Our cast and crew was overwhelmingly Chapman alumni, so that kind of gave us that initial just like built-in infrastructure coming out of college. We shot here in my hometown of Boise, Idaho, so we had some local, more adult crew, if you will. So it was kind of 50-50, like recent college grads, or even like our first AD and most of our camera team, like, were still in school. So we wrapped on like a Friday at 5 a.m. and then they went back to the hotel, packed up, got in the car, drove back to California, returned our camera package, and then went to first day of first semester on Monday. Yeah. So it was a little bit of mixing and matching, but it was nice for us to have, I think, a crew that was really technically savvy and was very comfortable with the like hierarchy of set. So that was nice for us. And then I think, again, in regards to this question of access, I don't necessarily have great things to say about my program. There are all kinds of things I would critique about as far as what I actually learned in my program at Chapman. However, I think since I've graduated, I've become more aware of how that networking stuff is really helpful. Like, my best friend works at CAA. Like, I have lots of friends who work at agencies. I have people who can send me out for generals, and that, like, there's something weird about like being the talent where like, oh, you're a writer, oh, you're an actor, like you are the meat that goes out to market. But it certainly helps to have people who are in the positions to try and help you get hired. And I don't know where I would be if I didn't have some of that. Like, I'm very grateful to have also gone the solo production route with this feature. Like, I was not even a month out of college when we shot and produced, and like I financed and like did all of that big picture stuff, which I don't know if I always did well, but was definitely a learning curve. So I think I now kind of have the best of both worlds. Like, I'm not afraid if I had to produce again for no money on my own. And I have a very clear sense of what my next feature project will be. I want to start directing. I want to start moving in that direction. And like, I think I have some of the skills to do that. But it sure doesn't hurt to have people who can give you money, because there's not a lot of money or like built-in infrastructure if you're just like winging it on the indie side.
That leads hopefully quite nicely onto you, Andrea. If you
I came a bit of a mixed route, like most people as well. I mean, I didn't come from a family background that had anything to do with film or entertainment, and but did fall into doing a lot of theatre work as a student. So very much my earliest sort of jobs were producing on the Fringe in theatre and working in the West End to earn some money. And then I came up through a very mixed physical production and development path. So I would go off and take roles on productions. I think my very first job was as a location assistant on a terrible British gangster movie, which I thought was brilliant. Went horribly over schedule, I remember, which I just thought was fun. And then, working a bit on script and in development in a place called First Film Foundation, which sadly doesn't exist anymore. But actually, as it turned out, it wasn't planned at all. It was a pretty good education for being a producer, because I got to do a bit of everything. I was doing a bit of production, a bit of development, a bit of talent promotion, and then came up as a producer. Very much, did a whole bunch of short films, some of which won awards, and started producing bits in TV and features. So I've probably made, I don't know, 8, 9 features now. Yeah.
Thank you. And last but not least, Andy.
Yes, when you said Andrea, I was like, oh, she's calling me by my full name.
And
I realized there's another Andrea. I was like, oh yeah, there's another Andrea. It's not me. So I love hearing what everyone says, because I feel like there's definitely bits and pieces that I'm like, oh yeah, I know that space, or I know that world. But my first and really last job within the like film industry was like being in a Toyota commercial when I was 18. And I went to school in undergrad for acting. So, it's interesting hearing Debbie say that like around 40 of the roles like kind of go to shit, because I felt that way very much when I was like 19. Like I was like, all of the roles are terrible. Like I went to school for acting. I want to tell stories that like mean something, that are powerful, that will, forward humanity and like cause change. And like I just didn't feel that in the industry. And so, similarly to sort of what's already been said, I shifted more into the directing and producing space, because I wanted to have agency over what stories I was telling and was helping to tell. And I was like not interested in being treated like a piece of meat. After undergrad, that's kind of like, I went through that and saw a lot of my friends go through that in school, and was like very uninterested. So after college and after my Toyota commercial debut, I really started, I like shifted more into the independent film space. And like the first thing I did was direct a micro short, which I also self-produced. And then the film I made after that was Luke and Joe, which is the feature film that played at Spirit of Independence. And I was a producer on that and acted in it, and costume designed it as well. And have really been in the independent film space ever since. So I'm technically not still in the industry, which is just, an interesting contrast to what other people have spoken about.
Thank you. So trying to form my questions now, because there's so much excellent information. I suppose a lot of you have mentioned there not really being a really clear way in, which I think is very true. It's very misty and can be quite confusing. And as a result of that, lots of you have done kind of a really broad selection of roles. Do you think that is kind of necessary for development, or do you think it's a product of just there not really being a clear way in? So you end up doing lots and lots of little bits until you really can kind of find your own voice. That makes sense.
I think for me, for myself, I'd say it was just a needs must situation. Really, it's you know, I never ever had any desire to do any producing. For example, I didn't know that I knew how to do that or wanted to do that, but I always ended up doing a lot of the producing on everything, and I think I'm quite good at that in some ways, although it's not really the way I'd like to go. What I'd really like to do, if I can, is work with producers now that can take more and more of that on. So people that have got more time to sort of fully take on a project. And I think it's fair enough when you're first starting out that you do end up doing a lot of that stuff yourself, because at the end of the day, it's your project and you're the person that's getting probably the most out of it in a way. So I think it's good that you put that work in, but it also, you know, really helps to teach you what it is that other people's roles, you know, entail. So you know, it's like I write and direct and produce a bit, and each of those roles are quite different. So I guess it's kind of like learning about what each of those roles involve, so that when you're working on projects that you are doing maybe just one of those roles, you kind of appreciate a little bit more what the other team, crew and cast, etc., are actually being required to do. So I found that really kind of helpful, really.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of it is just realizing how much cash flow it takes to get a project off the ground. Like, I mean, and again, we were very ambitious. Like, we chose to do a feature right out of college, and everybody said you should do it as a proof of concept. You could workshop the short, and we were just like, if we don't make it now, we're never going to make this. We're not going to want to make this movie in 3 or 4 years after we've gone to all the work of trying to shop it and execute a short and do all these things. And it was important. I wanted to be in it and I wanted to produce it. And I knew those things wouldn't happen if we sort of took the long haul. Mm-hmm. And so I think simultaneously, like, yes, if you want to see the stuff made, you have to wear all the hats, because they're right when your pay scale is 0. Hi, do you want to make $1,000 for 6.5 months of full-time work? I mean, the answer is no. Nobody wants to do that. And the only people who will do that, who aren't you, are probably your friends. And while sometimes that can be great, often the problem is your friends lose steam halfway through, because they're like, oh, I like you, but now I'm not doing my job. And you don't have anything to leverage because you don't have any money. So for us, like, I was really just supposed to write the movie and let it go exist in the world. And then it very quickly became apparent that if I did not do a lot more, no one was going to make this movie. So I think for those early projects, and especially if you're ambitious or maybe foolish enough to try and tackle a feature where you don't have talent, where you don't have talent attached and you don't have anyone of note to like help get the bus moving, I think that's the only thing you could do. And maybe even outside of whether or not a feature is the goal for you, I think if you want to act or you want to write, or God forbid you want to do both, like, and I'm sure Andy will echo this, like what, you're going to wait 25 years in the hope that maybe you hack into a project that's great, or like you can spend most of your life playing dead prostitute number 3. Like, we don't have time for that. We want to make good things that matter. And there isn't a lot of access to that. And so I think that's what often prompts actors to become writers, or writers to become actors. And like, that's how you're able to start getting seen, and you have stuff for your reel that's not embarrassing.
Yeah, Michaela, I love that you asked that. And Lily, I love that you named the question of resources, because I feel like it does a lot of the time sound really glamorous to be like, I costume designed and like produced and also acted. But like the reality is that like I would have loved to like not do all of those things, right? But when it comes down to like being in the independent film space and just like not having enough resources and enough financing, if your options are like, don't make the movie, or like make the movie and pull a shit ton of weight, like that's what I'm going to pick. But I would not ever want that for anyone else. And especially when it comes to questions of like equity and like redistributing wealth within the industry, like it's not a sustainable way to make movies, I don't think. But like also is the other option just like be a PA for like 10 years or 5 years to work your way up, which like no shade on anyone that does that. That's like a great path. But I think if you want to be a director or producer, like you just figure out ways to get things made, and hope that you'll like hit that festival jackpot, or find the like magical private investor that will finance your project, so that you can do them in a way that actually is like really supportive for everybody that's involved.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of agree with everyone. I think it's important for people to realise that there isn't a right way in, and that if you get any panel of any people working in a business together, everyone's going to have a completely different route, and none of them are right or wrong. I think if you're a producer or director, by necessity, you need to be entrepreneurial, and you just need to keep yourself busy and out there. And you literally never know which project or set of people you're going to run into are going to be people that you're going to carry with you as your kind of creative collaborators into the future. And things move in very mysterious ways. But yeah, you can't sit around waiting for it. You need to kind of make things happen for yourself. Mm-hmm. Very, very few people are sort of courted and offered opportunities on a plate, unless you're extraordinarily lucky. There's nothing I regret doing in any of my early work that I did. I think even stuff that was not so brilliant as projects, I learned more perhaps from the ones that didn't quite map out than on the kind of the better things. So it's all part of your learning.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, there's always space to learn, and no matter what you're doing, you're gaining experience in some sense, whether it's kind of good or bad. You're learning and growing and developing as you go. Just bringing the conversation kind of back round to looking at equity and equality. Obviously, a lot of you have been working on self-funded, a lot of you have produced, taken on kind of bigger roles because you've moved into a more independent kind of into the independent film sector. Have you found that working in those spaces gives you more freedom to create more, I suppose, kind of diverse working environments, or do you find that you're really restricted by budgets, and so you're just like, I can't think about that right now, I just have to make this work?
Because of the last couple of years I've been doing some TV directing, I've comparing that to doing my own projects, it's just a completely different world. And I think what I like about my own projects and indie films and things is that I've got a control over that. I can decide who I hire, and I can think about what kind of team I want. Whereas if I go on direct TV, I've got virtually no say in that at all. I mean, maybe over the casting, depending on guest parts that aren't already cast and stuff, but the rest of it, I have no say in that team at all. So it's such a different situation and feeling and experience. I much prefer the first one, like being able to sort of, have that control and that say from the beginning. So, that making sure that you're working with a diverse team and people that have got, can bring their own great qualities to the film. So I find it quite interesting, that other side of it, that sort of going in to what I'm given situation. But as Andrea mentioned, you learn loads by that as well, and sort of like just figuring out the best way to negotiate with that one. But I definitely prefer being able to choose.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think I've noticed things in different ways. I mean, like, as a producer, you're always at some level responsible for casting and crewing and building, the stories that you choose in the first place. And, I'm, I was going to say lucky, but it's partly through choices. I've worked with a lot of female directors and LGBTQ directors, and, it's, I've always tried to represent, the full gamut of everyone in society. It's boring just in one narrow thing, and there's there's far too many narrow stories around, so there's definitely a long way to go on that front. But I don't know, I mean, I always feel like, certainly the teams I work with are very, very heavily female, and I've not noticed a particular difference depending on whether it's a more commercial project or more independent minded, but that's because I guess I'm always doing them. There is definitely in some areas, there's absolutely not parity, and it's not representative of the makeup of the UK, you know, let alone anything else. And you know, the only encouraging thing I think is that, you know, I think in the last year I've heard this conversation the loudest that I ever have, in terms of what do we do and how do we do it, and how do we encourage more people to come into the industry, how do we grow opportunities. You know, I mean, even weird things like the last few productions I've had have closed down internships because, you know, this idea of like people saying, oh, I've got a nephew or I've got a kind of kid or whatever, and that sort of nepotism that has come in, and you realise how much that is part of how people get into the film industry, because there is no clear path in, and these opportunities need to be actively offered to people who are not able to kind of access those easy routes. So I think things like that, just to kind of say we need to kind of completely stop this sort of little closed shop that we've got going on.
I think there's a lot of, I mean, and this isn't a radical thought I'm having, I think any of us would agree, there's a pretty significant surface level push for greater diversity of women and brown people and LGBTQ community, and I think that's great. And I mean, across different studios or production companies, it sounds like people are doing that in different degrees of meaningful success. But I think to Andrea's point, like what we really need is, like, we need meaningful systemic change, right? And again, thinking about your intern program and being aware of a certain degree of favoritism or nepotism that exists there. But I think beyond that, it's the idea that I interned a lot in college, like in LA, and I'm glad I did it. And I had 5 internships and 3 of them were unpaid, and I commuted 5 hours a day to make no money. And you're definitely in a certain kind of like tax bracket personal situation if you can essentially work 16 to 24 hours a week for no money. And, you know, I totally understand, depending on where you're working, smaller production companies, you know, that's not in the budget. But when it's like you're working at a big brand name place, and I imagine your boss is paid pretty comfortably and you make no money, that's insane. I know people who paid for their own parking in LA. I know people who didn't have parking passes and were expected to move their cars every 2 hours to pay for street parking while interning. And that's insane. And I think we need a more meaningful examination of those kinds of barriers to entry. I truly don't think there's ever been a better time to like be a woman of color trying to break into the industry, because you're very shiny to people who would like to, I don't mean to make it sound cheap, but who would like to buy you or staff you or rep you. And I, again, don't disregard my own hard work or things that I've put into hopefully to wanting to be here and hopefully deserving to sit at the proverbial table somewhere down the line. But so much of that is just a degree of financial privilege that I think remains pretty invisible. And I don't see a lot of people making meaningful steps to address. So I think a lot of people's hearts are in the right place. I think I am optimistic we're moving in more of that direction, but like it really needs to be like a reallocation of resources.
Yeah.
Bottom up.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. I know, Debbie, earlier you mentioned that you had been on a scheme. I think in the last couple of years, I've seen more schemes, paid work schemes to get people into industry than there has been in kind of previously. I know I benefited personally from a traineeship in film exhibition distribution and sales in the UK that was funded by is it still Screen Skills? Yeah, Screen Skills. And I'm wondering if there's anything similar in the US that's trying to kind of move the industry away from unpaid internships into funding paid work, because it's a major problem, and across all sectors as well: exhibition, cinemas, festivals, distribution, development. Everyone seems to be, for such a kind of not corporate industry, but one that does kind of churn money, for so much of it to be relying on unpaid work. I don't know if there's any, if either of you from the US have similar experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, like in regards to, I definitely can't speak for Hollywood because that's not my space, but I will say just like speaking from a place of like film within the US, because I know obviously the history is very different in the UK, and I don't know a lot about sort of what issues have permeated film sets the most in the UK versus here, but I definitely feel like within the United States, the film industry and the way that it plays out is really reflective of a lot of the societal issues that are the most prevalent in the United States, specifically like racism and misogyny and all of these forms of oppression that are like part of the fabric of culture here. So I definitely think, and capitalism and money is like absolutely, you know, one of those things. And I definitely feel like Hollywood does the same thing that we see happening on a national scale, where like there's all this money and it's in Hollywood and there's so many movies being made, and like there's like Transformers like 27 coming out, you know, and all of these people that can make movies really like at the drop of a hat, if that's the saying. But then there's so many other filmmakers that are not in that space that have no money and are hustling constantly to get any type of funding. And as Lily was saying, I feel like in terms of like equity in the way now, there's this very like surface level push to like appear equitable and like woke, for lack of better words, that it's like a glaze. It's like industries know now and companies know now that like they'll get slammed if they are saying anything other than that. But like if there is money coming out, especially for like indie filmmakers or people of color, the LGBT community, like it's in a lot of the big companies' own self-interest. And so, I mean, I certainly have had trouble finding financing that wasn't attached to big companies. And even that being said, I don't think there are huge pushes within the studio system to finance independent film and to support the people that are really trying to like direct and produce on an independent level. I certainly think that there's enough money to do that. So I really would love and hope that someone is working to figure out how to sort of like redistribute that wealth. I certainly think about it a lot and have thoughts about it, but I definitely think that it plays out in the way that there's a lot of money in one place that goes to sort of the same group of people. And then there's a lot of us that are sort of like in this indie film middle lower space that are just like really scrapping together financing the best that we can.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting point. And I would say one of the things that I have kind of started to notice being in the cinema space and being a film programmer is that it feels like there's a little bit of loss of kind of the middle space in terms of budgets. There's loads of like super refreshing and exciting first features and kind of low budget features coming through. And then there's lots and lots of these kind of franchised studio features that have enormous budgets, but less than there used to be of that kind of comfortable middle that is perhaps someone's second, third or fourth film, where they're really starting to get a sense of their voice and have built a career for themselves. I suppose, have you also seen that, or do you think that has an effect on who gets to tell stories or who gets to kind of build a consistent career?
I mean, that's been a trend that's been going on for some time in the UK and in the independent space, in the US as well. Yeah, it absolutely affects things. It's very, very difficult now to have a sustained career, particularly as a director. You can be a little bit more sort of deft as a producer because you can kind of keep shifting. I mean, I'm sort of probably a typical independent producer that I work mainly in features, but I do feature documentaries. I'm working on a 6-part TV series at the moment for Apple, so you can move around a bit. You don't have that freedom as a director. I mean, we are lucky in the UK that we do have this very well-funded public money system, so there is cultural funding for film, and you can, if you're lucky and talented and in the right place at the right time, find yourself being funded to make a first feature at $500,000 or $1 million. There's been a trend back to the slightly bigger ones recently. You can make 1.8 million or something if you're just with public money, but you do have to knock it out the park to get to do another one. And it's a tricky one. I feel very, very torn on it, because as much as I think that's a sort of a loss and people don't get given the opportunity to grow as an artist and to kind of find a voice, and it's very, very limiting, you know, the numbers aren't there for the audiences. You know, these films do not make any money. So, you know, you can make a film for £1 million and it makes 300 grand at the UK box office and doesn't really travel, and people will see that as sort of a culturally funded positive thing to have done. But you try to do that at 5 or 6 million, suddenly you've got real money at stake. You can't put a film at that level together with just public money. You need commercial money, and they're just not going to do it unless they can see a path through to audience. So yeah, it affects the stories that I choose to tell and the people that I choose to work with as a filmmaker. Absolutely. I wish I knew a sort of better answer of how to get around that, but I mean, until there's a better distribution system which is really locked into audiences who are seeking out that kind of content, it's going to remain a key one.
Do you think any of that kind of space is being filled by television or by kind of the big streamers who are?
No, not really. I mean, it's funny. There has been I remember seeing it a couple of years back. I was at LFF and at a party with a lot of new filmmakers, and you know, and everyone was doing the kind of "what have you seen" chat, which normally would be kind of, "I've seen this little movie," and you know, it's and everybody at that party was going, "Oh my God, have you seen Chernobyl?" And thinking, "Oh, here we go. You know, this is different. You know, everybody is. You know, these are independent filmmakers. They're all watching television," and I know now, I mean, like, you know, I'm doing something now, and you know, they are very, very risk averse. I mean, I think, you know, there's a sort of very, very nascent early growth period where you see Netflix and people taking risks and being the sort of alternative distribution, and very, very quickly they're becoming the mainstream, and therefore they're taking, if anything, less risks than the main, you know, the film sector. So no, I wish that was the case, but I mean, maybe people like Mubi, and you know, there's been some amazing people in the US, and, you know, A24 and Neons and all these guys who are brilliant. Very hit by the pandemic, of course. So you know, there is always people that come up that love film and love the work and try and make a way of finding and building an audience appetite for it. I mean, I don't know. It's why this pandemic is so heartbreaking, because you think it comes out of a year where Parasite won the Best Picture Oscar. Yeah. I mean, like, that's unbelievable. You know, the Portrait of a Lady on Fire is getting an audience. You know, you think suddenly that hasn't happened in years, and then poof, we're sort of back down.
We had a really incredible opening quarter at the cinema, and then closed for 6 months, and are desperately trying to figure out how we rebuild that.
That is the big challenge. Yeah, I mean, you know, I think if the work keeps coming, which it will, hopefully we can rebuild it and we get audiences. But it's it's sad.
Okay, trying to flip more positively, if I can, with a big question. No, it's fine. If you could, if someone granted you to be the president of the industry, if any of you could radically change a single part of the film industry, cinemas, distribution festivals, the way that films are released, to create a system that could be more rooted in equality, what would it be? Go. No, I'm joking.
I think one thing that's quite important is starting with the actual stories that people are allowed to tell. I think the scripts and the stories, and who can tell them, because there's an awful lot of gatekeeper stuff goes on in the film industry, and actually, you know, there's a lot of people with a really unique voice that have got great stories that they could tell were they ever given the opportunity, and they're often not, or it's very, very, very hard for them to do that. As someone mentioned before, it's like, especially if you don't have a family that's in the industry that can give you that, you know, that step up in the first place, etc. So I think I would like to look at how opportunities can be created more for that, because I think, or often, like, certain people, even if they're allowed to make a film, there's expectations on them to make a certain kind of film. You know, I've talked to quite a few friends about that, and being, you know, a sort of northern-based working class woman, men older now as well. There's certain expectations of what you should make, and I know a lot of people in the north often are expected to make like a social realism film or about somebody desperately surviving on benefits, for example. And one of the films I've got in development at the moment is about 2 performance artists, and I've had some quite funny conversations with people already about this. And one of them was just like, so it's about a performance artist, what, in Sheffield? And I was like, yeah. And straight away that was kind of like, they said, maybe could you not set it in New York or London? And I was like, well, we do have performance art in Sheffield. We do, like, stories in Sheffield aren't just about people on benefits or struggling on 0-hour contracts and things. People can make films about other things, and I'm sure everybody's got examples of that, of like the stories that we are expected to tell based on who we are as people. And they might not always be that kind of film. You might have you might have somebody from a very underprivileged, difficult background who wants to make a beautiful, poetic, high art film. I mean, who's to say that they can't? And I just think it's interesting that there's a bit of a closed shop, a bit of a gatekeeper situation that says certain people can do this and you can't. And I just think, if people were allowed to tell the stories they wanted to tell, I think that would change quite a few things personally.
Thank you. And I agree, it's not grim up north all the time. We do need some happy films from Sheffield, please. What about the rest of you, Andy, Lily and Andrea?
Yeah, I feel like within the United States, it's just a massive question. Like, what would you change to create equity within the film industry? Because there are just so many things that you can change. But, I feel like this, considering the question you asked before about like who gets to tell stories and like how money plays into that, I really like feel like from the bottom of my heart, if like someone brilliant could figure out how to like take the money and distribute it so that like people in Hollywood can keep making movies, that's great. And I know that it's an industry and people need to make money, but I feel like there is enough, like if people don't have the opportunity to make their first or their second film, like they'll never get to that place where they can be one of the big players in the industry because they won't have the experience. And so like I feel like the way it's playing out here in the United States is just that like it's a very white male dominated industry, and like of course that's getting better. There's lots of pushes for it to not be that, but like historically that is what it's been. And so like if the narrative is like, well, you have to have done X, Y, and Z, to be a big player, then there's this whole group of people that are coming up after this initial, the people that have had resources, predominantly men, who are in the weeds, so it's like I feel like if wealth could be redistributed within the industry and people had the opportunity to like make that first film or make that second film and get the experience so that they could be bigger players in the industry without having to work 5 times as hard, that would change a lot of things. And I also will say, like, I feel like if there were people of different lived experiences that were more like in the industry, there were more leaders of different kinds of people of different lived experiences, then like that would also help to mediate so much of the harm that's caused in the industry. Because if there's only if 75% of the industry leaders in the United States are like white men, then like like what's the history there? It's not good, unless like all of those men are like doing their personal practice, like how am I perpetuating oppression, which like maybe they are, I hope they are, but like a really easy way to like shift that is like accountability by like having different people in leadership. I think Ava DuVernay is like she just is in the Academy now, and is like there's like very few Black people in the Academy. There's like the Criterion Collection is like no directors of color. It's like there's like a million things that could be changed, but I feel like having more people resourced would be one thing that would cause a lot of other things. That was kind of a long answer, but I feel very passionately about that.
No, I mean, I would certainly agree with what everyone said as far as leadership, of course, and diversity of those gatekeepers so that you're creating more ability for people. Not that men or straight white men, we like you, thank you. We're not saying you can't relate to stories about women, but of course, when you diversify those gatekeepers, you're creating more lateral space for those gatekeepers to be moved by different kinds of stories. And if all your gatekeepers are a certain demographic of person, you're probably squeezing out other kinds of stories that might be more resonant with a different group. But I also think, and I apologize if this is a little bit pseudo-intellectual, but it's something I think about a lot. I think to me, maybe the biggest, that's pretty ambitious. We'll go with one of the biggest problems in the industry is like this real obsession with like artistic canon that like, these are the classic films. These are the best films that have ever been made. And if you don't love The Godfather and you don't think Citizen Kane is the best piece of artistic mastery that's ever happened, then you're stupid and you don't understand film and you probably don't belong here. And I get that that sounds very extreme, but I think coming out of a film school background, but I think even just culturally and like colloquially, and I'll speak to the US, I'm not sure how well that translates in the UK, but like that is like phase one of what tells women in a room that like, if you don't resonate with this story about being a white man in World War II, you aren't very smart and you don't really belong in this room. And with all due respect to movies about World War II, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I think that's ridiculous. I think that it really pushes out the idea of indie cinema. I think it really pushes out the idea of anything we've made in the last 25 years. And that somehow the best pieces of art we've ever made were made in 1975 by a bunch of, I'm sorry, maybe very talented, but extremely problematic white guys who we're now having those cultural reckonings about. And I think that the more glamorization and obsession, not just with that work, because I'm not here to throw shade on any director or artist whose work you just happen to really enjoy and resonate with, but this really like almost like beyond human, like godly obsession with like, no, but he's a genius. And art is something that normal people shouldn't understand and also somehow justifies your horrible behavior as like, oh, but he was just really good at being a leader. And I'm like, no, leaders don't scream at their crew and they don't sexually assault people. And they don't, and at a certain point, like, I don't really care if your art was good, if the way in which you lived your life and conducted your business was disgusting. And I think the more that we harken back to like the finger pointing of like, but the golden age of film was way back then, aside from that being problematic, I just don't think that's true. And I think that's ground zero of like, where we're smashing diversity, we're glamorizing a really problematic time in American history. And like I've seen this like in lectures or with guest speakers or in screenings that like you see all the women in the room be like, oh, well, I didn't really like that. So like, am I just not smart? Did I just not get it? And it's like, no, maybe you just didn't like it. And that's fine. And similarly, I don't think it's men or white men's obligation to like, you need to love experimental art house films by women of color. Like we all like what we like and that's totally fine. But I don't think white men or otherwise, we don't get a lot of exposure to filmmakers outside of whatever this theoretical canon is. And I think that's really sad.
Yeah.
Michaela, can I respond to Lily super quick? Yeah. Before you move on, I just had like one thing to add because I love everything that she said. I was just thinking of like a really tangible example of that, Lily, which is D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which like, I don't know if any of you all in the UK I think a lot of people are familiar with that movie, but it's a movie that came out in 1916 that is basically like accredited with bringing back the KKK in the United States and like creating racial terror again. And like, that's a movie that film professors nationwide, maybe worldwide, I don't know about the world, but will say, but D.W. Griffith, like there was groundbreaking cinematic language in this movie. And so like, we're going to watch it and study it in class, which is like, okay, like maybe it is groundbreaking cinematic language, but like, does that justify bringing back the KKK? And like, should every film professor make all of their students sit through a movie that is very traumatizing and can be very traumatizing to people? And like, I know there's definitely a spectrum of like, people can handle it. And also like, I don't think that students should have to sit through that if they don't want to, you know, and like maybe there's a space for that movie, like in a museum, you know, about that time in history. Like, I don't think that movie should be like blacklisted and erased from the world, but like, I don't think that D.W. Griffith needs to be like up on a pedestal. I mean, Lily said not throwing shade, but it's like, no, I mean, I kind of do throw shade because like there needs to be accountability within the industry. And I think that's another issue is like, there's a lot of, you know, like unions and guilds and whatnot, but like the director somehow gets like a little pass because of their creative genius. So like in the United States, you see all of these directors that like just are not being accountable for what they're creating because of their like creative vision and creative genius. And it has an impact, right? Like media impacts society really strongly. So like, I just think the time for like the passes, it's like, it's not good, you know. It's like we're kind of past that. Like we need to not give people passes, and like people can make whatever movies they want to make, but it's like movies do impact people, and I think that's something that is just really important to consider too.
Yeah,
but it's also, isn't it, also about what people are, choices people are given, what they're exposed to. I mean, that Mark Cousins, was it, that made Women Make Film, the documentary, the 5-part documentary? You know, all those amazing examples. It's like they're not included in most film courses, books or whatever. It's like the same examples, like you said earlier, are cited again and again. But what about all of those that people don't even know about? And I was actually doing a little acting job a few months ago, just at the start of lockdown, for a university. I won't say where, but I was brought in to work with the film students so that they could direct actors, and it was really interesting. It was 4 days, and it was a male lecturer, and every single film that he quoted in all 4 of those days were films by white men. Every single one, every book and every film. So I kept chipping in. I think I was annoying him by the end. I was like, oh, there's this one. And it was kind of, but I just thought, you know, there's a lot of women on this course too. They're not being given one example of anything by a woman. And actually, a lot of the films he was citing were, in my opinion, pretty crap anyway, and sort of like old, dated, crap films. And I was just thinking, is that it? Like, are you not showing any other examples, any other kinds of things than these mainstream blockbusters? He kept quoting Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I was like, really? Like, there's nothing since then that you can use as an example. I just found it quite interesting, and I think, yeah, so going back to like things like these films that are held up to be the most amazing, it's like, what about all the others that aren't included?
Yeah. Yeah, and who decides what goes into the...
Exactly.
But then everyone is taught, and everyone is shown, and everyone has awareness of. I'm just going to put the question to you, Andrea, as well, about radical change. If you could change one thing, and then I'm going to see if we have any audience questions, because I'm aware that it's like 5 to 5.
No, I mean, all these answers are really interesting, and yeah, I mean, I completely agree with everyone. I guess, you know, once you've made a few films, your kind of concern, and the thing you think about a lot is less how do I get a film made, because, you know, that somehow films, you know, it becomes sort of less hard at that front, but how you get them seen is a continual problem. And there are really good films being made that completely reflect a diverse set of voices, and really brilliant films. I mean, you know, there's endless ones in the last few years, but how you bring that to audience and get the same kind of heat and buzz around them as you are these sort of very traditional, sort of same old shit we've seen for years and years and years kind of movies. And, you know, so that is my magic wand kind of, you know, wish, you know, and I think it's a mixture of the platforms in which we observe films. It's the machine that creates the buzz. It's the, you know, why have we got a national awards that is basically a copycat of the US Hollywood system? You know, why is there one category called British Outstanding Debut and nothing else, which is about preserving and promoting voices that are outside of the mainstream? And you know, because if people do tend to enjoy films like that once they're put in front of them, you know, and if you get them into a festival audience or a main cinema audience, people really will love it. You know, you do test screenings with people and, you know, just drag them in off the streets and they were like, oh, I'd never would have watched a film, gone to see a film like this, but I think it's brilliant and blah, blah, blah. But, you know, they're still electing to go and see Marvel or, you know, which nothing wrong with that. But so, yeah, I mean, I've got a film in cinema this week, which is a funny old time to be in cinemas, but it's directed by a woman, you know, Saint Maud. It's, you know, we've had the opportunity because of our strange times. We're on 370 screens, which in the UK, normally a British release of an independent film would be under 100. And, you know, we were number 1 in the box office in midweeks. You know, I think we're number 2 behind Tenant, you know, boo, anyway, closing the week. But, you know, people are going and they really like it and there's a buzz about it. And it goes to show if you sort of tell an audience they might like it and put it out there and find a way of being bold with it, you can connect people, but you're not always given those opportunities. So that's the bit we've got to crack, because there is good work already. We can make more of it, but we've got to get people in front of it.
Yeah, I mean, the success of St. Maud has been really wonderful to see at the moment, particularly at this time when all the some of the distributors are being really wonderful, but some of them are just throwing their films into next year. And I personally found it very heartening to be like, yes, people are coming to this film and they're really enjoying it.
Yeah, Studio Canal have been great, I must say, in that. But yeah, I get it for distributors as well. It's, you know, that there is, you know, cinemas are closing, you know, it's tough times.
it's scary times. But no, I agree with your point as well. I think even just the way that we rely so heavily on the first 3 days of a film's life, and then that 3 days decides the whole rest of its life, is kind of mind-blowing, because particularly for smaller titles, British titles that rely on word of mouth, things tend to build up in the second week, but by then lots of cinemas have not got the film on anymore. So I think there's lots that could change that. I just don't know who's going to do that. Who can do that? Ben, do we have any audience questions? Or
there's nothing that's come through on chat. So does anybody have any questions you would like to ask the panel? I've certainly got one I want to ask, but I'm certainly going to open it out first. So if you've got a question, I think perhaps the easiest way is just unmute yourself and just fire out the question.
I actually kind of have a question about when you were talking about things that, it was actually really interesting, the history of, especially in film schools and stuff, being taught everything by white males, and you know, there are a lot of movies out there that you expect to like and actually don't like. Taxi Driver being one of that. It's not my favorite. Still don't understand that one. But then when you look at things like what Angie talked about with things like the KKK movie back then that they talked about and is being so great cinematically, and how do you all feel about things like today, like on Netflix, that movie Cuties that came out, and I think that's by a woman, but there's a lot of controversy about that one as well. I mean, do you view that differently than you view something like KKK? Or, you know, because it's hard once you start saying that you sort of feel like one of them should be put in a museum, but then how do you feel about the others? I was just curious about like where you draw the line with things that you feel are should be accepted and things that shouldn't. And I think that's probably something that's everybody's struggling with, is my guess, the way things are going these days.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I definitely don't think there's like a hard and fast line, but I will say, like, looking at the impact directly, like Birth of a Nation did cause the KKK to emerge, which resulted in the killings of Black people in the United States. So like, that's like not, to me, that's like not a question of like, this had a terrible impact. Cuties, which I personally have not seen, but have heard many, many people talk about and have Red Writing's On, you know, I personally feel like after reading the director's intentions with the movie and reading critiques, that the reason that the movie has been so controversial is because of how like sexuality is looked at in the United States and how adolescence is looked at in the United States. And also just like the truth of that, like being, you know, a tween is like super uncomfortable. And I think that was from what it seems, obviously I don't know the director personally, but it seems like the director wanted to show that like this is uncomfortable, this is this awkward place of like, am I a kid or, you know, am I a teen? They're looking up to the teens and wanting to imitate them. And it seemed like it was very much supposed to be like a commentary on how sexuality impacts tweens in the United States, rather than a film that was glorifying that. So to me, those live in very different spaces. I certainly don't think that there's like, I think it's a very gray space, but I do think that like, you know, if like, I have not heard that like lots of people that are 12 are like watching Cuties and like acting out, you know, because of it. But like there was a very direct like social impact of Birth of a Nation that was terrible. So to me,
I suppose the question is really more though, does that now create an environment where it's more acceptable? As you know, a lot of different types of films come out. I mean, for example, people talk about, you know, gun violence and how horrible gun violence is, and kids coming into school and, you know, shooting up the school and stuff. But yet, as filmmakers, they're the ones that are putting out movies and have been putting out movies that have started to make it okay. I mean, okay in the sense that it's an everyday thing. So kids, so, you know, when I was growing up, I would witness the growth of that and could see how, wow, things are becoming more and more violent. Well, kids today, it's just an everyday thing. So does something like a movie like that, okay, people don't suddenly join the Klan and kill people, but are you starting to now make it something that's just neutral, that is not a big deal for people? And then what's the consequence of that? So that's where I never know what really where I stand on things, because, you know, there should be that full freedom of expression, and yet there are consequences with full freedom of expression sometimes, aren't there? And so who are we to judge which one is the one that should be and the one that shouldn't be? Because right now we really don't know what the consequences of a film like that will be 10 years from now.
Well, I think I completely agree, and I think you're bringing up some important issues, but to me those are two different questions, right? Like I certainly don't believe in the censorship or dissing of films based on what they're about. I don't even know, I mean, and I'll let Andy speak for herself, but I don't even know that I have a problem with like, you can't teach Birth of a Nation. But I guess the reason I was bringing that up was, if you're going to say these are the 10 best films ever made, and we're going to teach them in a class called The History of Film, and one of them, it's not just that it happened to incite racial violence, is actively pro-slavery, created for the purpose of inciting racial violence, and you've decided that is one of the 10 best films ever made, that seems like a ridiculous conclusion to me. Not because it's problematic, but of like, I do not believe there's anything in the visual style of Birth of a Nation that has never been done in another film anywhere else that we could talk about. So that to me feels like a very weird thing as, say, a faculty member who's probably an old white man, to cite that as like, these are the films we should hold up as the pinnacle of cinematic accomplishment. I guess if you were teaching a class on the history of American race relations through film and you wanted to talk about Birth of a Nation, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And as to the issue of something like, I don't want to talk too much about Cuties specifically. I saw it, I liked it. I personally do not agree with the critiques that have come out about it at all. But I think in relation to larger issues of like, right, but what if a film is promoting, we perceive that a film is promoting gun violence. We perceive that a film is promoting or glamorizing or normalizing rape, which is personally a big critique I have with like crime dramas in general. Like, just because it's a lady detective that investigates the brutal rapes of women doesn't make it better. Maybe we don't need to make that again. And I think that's something for filmmakers to be aware of. I don't think they should be held responsible or maybe not held responsible, but I don't think they should be punished or shunned or not allowed to make whatever they want. But I think there should be, in a perfect world, people who make films would see that as through the lens of personal responsibility and wanting to more thoroughly assess the impact of what you make and what you put out there. But I certainly don't think it's our job to tell people they can't make movies. I mean, unless that thing is like child pornography or, I don't, depending on where you live, saying the Holocaust didn't happen. I mean, there are certain kinds of issues maybe we would say fall under viable censorship laws, but beyond that, I think that's up to the individual. But to me, that's a separate conversation from what are we going to hold up as an industry and say, these are the best things we've ever made.
And Alexandra, like, I think that context, like Lily was saying, is huge. I mean, I have a 9-year-old too, right? So like with Birth of a Nation, like, even if you're a film professor that chose to show that, like, even just saying like, hey, this is a film that sparked the rebirth of the KKK, like, know that, rather than glorifying what's happening, I feel like makes a big difference. And like, I feel like it also comes down to like what each person believes individually, and like what we're teaching our kids. Like, what I think is okay for my 9-year-old to see is probably different than what someone else thinks is okay for their 9-year-old to see. And like, if I'm watching something with violence, I'm talking about that with my 9-year-old. And I think it's like, if I'm watching something where people are kissing or, you know, whatever, there's sexual tension, and she's making a comment, I'm like, oh, well, you know, what did you think of that? Like, why are you making a comment about that? And trying to go deeper so that she has an understand, you know, she can navigate for herself what makes sense to her, you know, within reason, of course. But I don't think it's black and white for those reasons too, because people feel very differently about like what is and isn't appropriate. And I think like what I'm doing in my house, what, you know, like compared to what's happening in the movie, like all of that contributes to then like what my kid thinks is like normal or okay, which would be different for another kid in another house. So I think there's like a lot of layers there too, in terms of like nurture and also like what's happening within media.
Do we have any other questions? I know, Ben, you said you had a question.
Yeah, so it's something I've talked to with a lot of the other filmmakers whose films I'm screening this year, and it's more about, I guess, the exhibition and the distribution aspect. So it'd be quite good to get your thoughts as well, Michaela. The way I always look at it is I'm a child of the 70s and 80s, and I knew the whole VHS boom, and back then it was great because you could go out and video shops needed content, so there's all this stuff being made all the time. But then obviously physical media dies down. And now we're in a position with the advent of digital filmmaking. It's a lot easier to go out and make your films and get them out there. But it's about where do you go? And it's kind of touching on a point that you were talking about earlier, Andrea, about where should or where could indie films actually end up now? Netflix is dominating streaming. Obviously, cinemas like the Showroom provide us that home for a lot of films. But what's the answer for indie films to actually get out there? Is there a kind of stranglehold on that side of the industry at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, I think. I mean that you know, there are examples of things that do just get made, and because they're great, they find their own path. I mean, I'd unpick a bit of that anyway. I mean, I you know, ever since filmmaking went digital, you know, some years ago now, there's been this idea that it's somehow got cheaper. And, you know, other than the fact that it's literally a bit cheaper to film digitally than actually processing film stock, it really hasn't. I mean, crew rates are rightly sort of, you know, people need to get paid a living wage. The size of crew that you need to make a movie is relevant, the format that you're shooting on. If anything, on the big movies now, when I look at the size of my camera team, you know, when they're working with a standard Venice or an Alexa package, there's more people, because, you know, you've got DITs and, you know, processing, you know, endless, you know. And so, I mean, films just do cost. You know, you can make them for sort of guerrilla, but I mean, to make stuff of a production value, there just is a baseline that is kind of beyond self-resourcing. You just do need proper funding, whether that be cultural or commercial. yeah, I mean, it's definitely not going to be Netflix that's going to come and rescue us. You know, it's great that they exist, and you know, they're very much, you know, the future is going to be mixed models, and there's always going to be VOD as part of the release of independent film now. But you know, we still need to get a cultural conversation going around film. We need to get people feeling that buzz, and it's got to be part of that must-see thing. I mean, I mean, I'm sort of product of the same era. I mean, on Saturday morning when I was a teenager, we would literally go and see whatever was on at my local cinema, and there would be a queue around the side of the cinema, and you knew that if your queue went past the bins, you weren't going to get in. Which was like, I mean, the very idea now of like not being able to get in on a Saturday matinee to a cinema is insane. And we'd go and see whatever else was on. You know, we'd end up seeing Teen Wolf or whatever shit was on just because you couldn't get into the thing that you wanted to go and see. And you know, we need to somehow rebuild that, where you know there's a buzz and a must see and a collective experience around it, and a feeling like it's relevant.
Yeah.
And that's got to be through a combination of festival work, great curation, great spokespeople, you know, diversifying our ridiculous award ceremonies, and you know, how do we champion what is good and interesting?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, and I find it really interesting because I think there was a lot of talk a few years ago about like all the streamers and how they're shaking things up, and cinema is going to be no more as cinema's been no more like every year since I was born. But I think what I would really like to see is a combination, as Andrea said, is of all these different formats of film watching and different ways that you can experience film really working together. I think it's an interesting time at the moment because I suppose over the last year, but certainly the last literally few weeks since cinemas have been reopened, we've had like the most collaboration with Netflix that we have ever. Obviously, previously they were taking a lot of stuff straight to streamers, but as films have been moving, we've been getting a lot more offer. We've got Rebecca on at the moment. There's Mank coming hopefully next month. And I think it's really important to kind of flatten access to different kinds of films, because, you know, if people are not so willing to take a risk and go to an independent and pay to see a film that probably they haven't actually heard of, but they're willing to do that online, and slowly that can build taste, having kind of, I'm pro there being more access to more different types of film, instead of like all the indies are over there and all of the commercial films are over there. I think we need to rebuild taste and enthusiasm for different kinds of films.
Well, and it's one of those things where like even outside distribution, which is an avenue I have not dealt with and quite honestly don't anticipate to touch on this very, very small film we just made, but you know, having that diversity of audience, like we did a local premiere here in Idaho, and our theater seated about 750 people, and we sold out, which is great. So we made some money, but we got to have a nice big full house for our one night party. And yes, that's fun because butts and seats is great. And yes, that's fun because we made a little bit of money, but you know, for Like Love, so much of that was, it's a romantic comedy, but it's a film that deals with like rape culture and sexual consent. And it was great to have people in the audience, a lot of like young men who were like my friends or colleagues who I don't think would have gone to see this movie or would have clicked on this movie if it showed up in their Netflix recs, but who I'd like to say liked it, if nothing else watched it, so I'll give them credit for that. No, I mean, I think we got good feedback, but to have people who like who were genuinely experiencing something different, and I don't think you can force people into doing that, but at least for me as a filmmaker, I think that's always what I want. Like, you don't want to feel like you're preaching to the choir. And yes, it's great to have people who are like, that's my experience and I'm seeing it happen and I feel very seen and validated, but like, you want to feel like you're sparking dialogue, and that can't happen. I mean, as Andrea keeps talking about, that can't happen if you aren't getting the kind of release or size or timeline that your audience can really expand in that way. And I don't know if that's something we can change just with like how algorithms work and how we consume most of our stuff online. But like in my dream world end game, I would love to see more of that, just in general.
Excellent. I appreciate time's ticking on, and this is a conversation that basically I could have with you all for the rest of the evening. But I think my wife and kids would probably have something to say about that. So I will kind of draw us to a close. And I guess it's a big thank you to everyone who's attended, but in particular our panel. So Lily, Andy, Andrea, Debbie, and of course Michaela. It's so insightful. And you know, from a personal perspective, I'll keep flying the flag for independent films as much as I can. Kind of yay me. But I think just hearing this point of view, all very kind of diverse ways that you've come into the industry, different thoughts, but all kind of focusing in the same direction. And I think if we keep having conversations like this, then we can keep kind of pushing some change. So from me, massive thank you. Michaela, have you got any closing thoughts you would like to say?
No, you've wrapped it up, I think. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you very much. I will put this live unless anyone's got any kind of real serious objections to me posting it on social media, but I think it's a fascinating discussion and I want people to see it. So thank you very much to everyone. Thank you all for attending. Hopefully those who are watching the festival, hope you enjoy the rest of the films. Yeah. If you got anything else, just come and give me a shout. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.